In this podcast, I want to talk about 3 leadership challenges and how to fix them. If you've never heard me before, my name is Paul Leon. I was a former college dropout who ended up getting his dream career, finishing his degree in organizational behavior, and has now trained over 2,000 professionals in consultative communication skills. Probably my biggest success, though, is being married to my wife, Trisha, and having 2 wonderful kids with her. So I say that not from a place just of privilege, but I say that from a place that I feel really lucky. I feel really lucky that I get to work hard on my marriage and work hard on my career and work hard on my education to grow as a person. And I think if you're somebody who works hard, values growth, this podcast is for you. So I want to start this episode with a question. Are you leading a diverse team or just hoping differences won't cause conflict? And I don't like using you statements. I like to use I feel statements because I think it's more inclusive. But I want you to think about that because I've had a lot of these conversations with the best leader I know, and that's my wife, Trisha. And I think if you were to ask me, like, what's the perfect manager look like? I would lean to her. And I'm not just saying that because it's the right thing to say, happy wife, happy life. I'm saying that from a place of integrity and true truth. So I'll give you a quote that I think will start us off even stronger. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. Let me say it again. Diversity is being invited to the party. Inclusion is being asked to dance. I want to be clear, that is not my quote. That comes from Verna Myers. She was the vice president of inclusion strategy at Netflix. I thought that was just a really cool quote because diversity is not just about representation, it's about impact. When a leader, manager, fails to recognize or manages differences effectively, that limits team performance and innovation. I think the challenge when we look at the first one here, which is being biased in decision making, is I think a lot of people, or I feel a lot of people, make objective choices because they align with someone who maybe looks like them, works like them, or feels more connected to them. And you have to ask yourself, this is a private conversation between you and the mirror, is have you ever had a situation where you made a choice based on someone's similarities on the surface, communication style, and their own career path when thinking about partnering with that person on a team or project? And I'm confident that I know I've made that mistake, and that's not a fun thing to admit. I think a lot of people have. But what I really want to challenge you to think about is, are you able to get different perspectives just working with the same type of people always? And I know that's kind of a weird question. There's a really interesting series on YouTube called Surrounded. My wife understands the value, but she doesn't really like to watch it. For some reason, I'm weird. I like things like that, or like you have different people come together from different backgrounds to challenge people's perspectives. And I could see why their videos have like millions of views because they take out some intense issues. But I also think those videos are important because if we don't look at both sides of an equation, we both can't get to how we both arrived at sometimes a different, and sometimes it's a similar answer, or sometimes it's the same if you're lucky enough. So again, you want to just ask yourself that question to the first challenge, which is being biased in decision making. The solution being is, if you have been biased, what can you do different to change that? How can you move the needle? Which now I'm going to go into my second challenge here, which is surface level inclusion. Here's another quote for you. When we listen and celebrate what is both common and different, we become wiser, more inclusive, and better as an organization. That comes from Pat Waters, Chief Talent Officer at ServiceNow. So I feel many leaders assume diverse hiring is just inclusion. But I think inclusion comes from not just what's on the surface also. It comes from what goes past that surface level inclusion. I know when I was working as a manager in the rental car world, we had a team of about 17 different people. I co-managed that with a couple other managers. And a lot of the times, teammates had big emotions. They had big feelings. They were taking on intense situations, huge KPIs they had to hit. And I would use the listening framework from my old mentor, Rick Bommeljay from Listening Pays. That's his book on sense, interpret, evaluate, respond. I encourage you, if you have like Spotify Premium or some audiobook, give that a listen. It's worth your time. And I think what's interesting for me, one of the things I would have a lot of good feedback from the teammates I would coach and one on one is that they always felt psychologically safe with me. And I didn't know what that word meant back then, but I heard them say that, I always feel really comfortable with you. I always feel like I could speak clearly with you and not be judged. And I think that's an important variable here. And it's good feedback. And I'm honored to have gotten that feedback. And I also feel sometimes I wasn't perfect, but to get that feedback meant a lot. But I think it's also something we miss a lot when it comes to inclusion is how important is psychological safety? How important are people truly being heard? Which is why I like that SEER acronym I mentioned earlier, sense, interpret, evaluate, respond. And we've got to measure inclusion in terms of how do we track how our different voices contribute to key decisions. And that's obviously part of a much probably bigger conversation you may have to have with your leadership, whatnot, but it's an important one to measure too. I read an article the other day that said middle managers are the most untreated group ever because they manage the expectations of above leadership and the below expectations of their team. And I actually agree with some of the stuff in this opinion article. And in my experience, whenever you see a lot of huge, massive layoffs, they're the first to get hit. And I say that to say the next time you meet a middle manager, shake their hand, say thank you for all you do, because the emotional stuff they deal with on a psychological safety level, just trying to balance both is super intense. It's like being a quarterback for one team while another team is trying to tackle you behind you, sometimes it may feel like. So let's get into the third challenge, which is managing conflict across different perspectives, hence that analogy. Here's another quote for you. Conflict can destroy a team which has spent time learning to deal with it. Let me say that again. Conflict can destroy a team which hasn't spent time learning to deal with it. Thomas Eisger is a leadership coach. So I'm pretty passionate about this third challenge because I feel I've got a huge amount of experience in it. And I've trained a lot on this through training DISC human behavior across different teams and different organizations. But the problem is different backgrounds bring different communication styles, which is why I think having a framework like DISC, Strengths Quest are really good investments to make because it gives you that unique perspective we talked about earlier, which can help to reduce those understandings and reduce that tension or even that disengagement, which is the problem we want to try to solve here. And leaders often, and I feel leaders often, address these conflicts hoping that they'll get resolved on their own. Or the biggest thing I'll see, especially sometimes, is they hope that if they do the bare minimum, it could just go away on its own. And I don't feel that that's always the answer. I'm not saying that blowing off steam or giving people space isn't part of the solution. It 100% is. But I think we have to have a bigger part in that story. In one of my earlier videos, I talked about how there was a trainer that I choose not to really associate with, not because I thought they were a bad trainer, it's because I think they were immature in how they thought about human behavior. They had said to me, all that stuff, Paul, with DISC and stuff, it's silly, it's immature, and it's dumb. And that trainer then ate a donut and then walked away. And like I've said, I don't have a problem with anybody eating donuts. I really didn't have a problem with that at all. What I had a problem with is why would you knock something you have no clue about? Make one assumption and let that be your entire perspective on it. Look, everybody's entitled to free will. I'm a big believer in free will. I think you should do whatever you want. But if you're also not going to choose to investigate, get a little bit more information, and see the value and maybe the challenges that don't work for you, don't talk. Keep it to yourself. That's my opinion. Or go hire a therapist and talk to them. Because if you ever read How to Win Friends and Influence People, I'll tell you what, you don't even have to read the whole thing. Just read the first chapter. Don't ever criticize, condemn, or complain. Got it? So let's get into a little bit more in this content as I kind of went on a side note there. So I'm going to give you a framework that I personally like to use to mitigate, reduce conflict. And I recommend that if you are in a conflict situation or you want to get ahead of it around these skills, because it is a skill, especially being a leader or management, this is for you. So the acronym is PERSIST, which aligns with my personal brand, Persistence Mastery. So the first letter when you have conflict situations is P for pinpoint the issue. You want to pinpoint the exact issue. Now, when emotions are high, intelligence is low. You've probably heard that at some point in your career if you're a little more seasoned like myself. So it's important to take that first P, try to let emotions die down to get to the heart of the issue. E in persist is evaluate, perspective without bias. I have a bad habit where when I'm uncomfortable, I will laugh, or I feel sometimes it's time to make a joke. Let me tell you why this is a bad habit. People's emotions are not a joke. People's situations are not a joke. And laughing or chuckling actually hurts or tells the person they're not important. If you have this bad habit or have known this bad habit like I have made, I encourage you to that instead of chuckling or laughing, just be quiet. And I know that sounds weird to say, or what I've seen a lot of good leaders do is they put their hand over their face like they're thinking. Just give that a shot. So the R in persist, we've covered P, which is pinpoint issues, E, which is evaluate, perspective without bias. R is to reframe towards solutions. So, and that's about, we'll go with another football analogy, that's about giving the players who have the conflict the ball to see how they want to run toward the end zone. So maybe just ask them the question like, if I could wave a magic wand and we could go back and change how things were done, what would you recommend that we do? I see a lot of good leaders do this. I saw one woman vice president. I was in a meeting and I had never seen this before. It's actually really cool. I was doing a presentation. She goes, Paul, what would you do to help change this large part of the organization? And on the org chart, and I mean this in the nicest way possible, I'm pretty confident who myself, but on paper, I didn't feel that I deserved that question. But I felt really empowered by this woman that she asked that, even though she was in a vice president role, to give me an opportunity to give my perspective. And it really showed to her character and how smart she was. In fact, I believe some of the best managers and leaders I have known have been women. They know how to be inclusive. They know how to be emotionally intelligent just on a natural level. And they know how to bring a lot of teams together. I think that's why I'm very blessed to have my wife and blessed to have been trained by many women who are way better managers and leaders than me. And that might just be a personal opinion, but that's just been my experience. So the I in persist is implement ownership. So we talked about the football analogy and giving them ownership over the ball. There's a huge difference in doing a training and presentation. And the difference is an exercise. I'll tell them, if what you're doing that day for your presentation doesn't include a breakout or some type of activity, it's not a training, it's a presentation. Think about it. If you were to go to the gym and the guy you hired to be your personal trainer never put you on any machines but told you what they all did, were you in a training session or in a talking presentation session? So you want to implement ownership on who owns what in the conflict and how to mitigate and reduce that. S is sustain change through accountability. So it kind of seems to cross over into ownership, but now we need to get more specific. So when we say sustain change through accountability, what I mean by that is, how are you going to have them on what timeline? Like, can you reduce these types of argumentative discussions around X topic by 30 days from now? That's sustaining change through accountability, giving yourself deadlines, giving them deadlines to when they can do that. And I wouldn't say deadlines. Now, I would probably say milestones. Conflict is not one of those things that end instantly. I have some personal conflict I've known in my family. And what a lot of people don't know is some conflict can grow for many, many times and it doesn't get handled properly and we just let it fester. There's actually been a lot of studies that show the emotional trauma of some of that heavy conflict can be equal to more or less to a death in the family. That's a pretty intense example. I'll give you another one. The book Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl. There's a story of the survivors of what they went through in the Nazi concentration camps. Was at any time somebody felt suffering, and this is what Viktor Frankl observed, they could grab an electric fence and just give up. And what he noticed after he survived, it's a really good book if you ever get a chance to skim it, is he started taking more therapy with people after he survived the concentration camps, started listening to people's problems, their personal life, and he's noticed that the same emotional pain that somebody in the concentration camps had felt the same to somebody going through a divorce. Now, I want to be very clear here with this analogy and in this reference point. I do not believe on paper that going through that horrific experience is the same as a divorce, like on a logical level. But I understand the logical, emotional intelligence of what Viktor Frankl was trying to say in the sense that suffering is relative to the situation. So you can't reduce or mitigate someone's feelings because it just tells them they're not enough. The last letter in persist is turn mistakes into growth opportunities. So this is the last letter in persist. We covered P, pinpoint issue, E, evaluate perspective without bias, R, reframe toward solutions, I, implement ownership, sustain change through accountability, and turn mistakes into growth opportunity. I'll give you a story. There was a young woman who I had the pleasure of working with for some time. And her biggest issue when she had first got into consultative selling was everything had to be perfect and everything had to be exactly where it needed to be all the time. And she was very smart. She was a biology major. She's way smarter than me. And I'll never forget, she had her first consultation and the customer had challenged them on some type of obstacle of confusion. And she had put her pen down and said, well, what do you want to happen? And then the customer got more agitated and said, and I'm not, there was that bad habit again, but she goes, listen here, sweetie, it doesn't work that way. And it became a very awkward situation. After that moment ended and she didn't get the sale, she said to me, like, what could I have done different? And I said, listen, there is no amount of advice that I can give you other than if you take the time to reflect on the mistake you made and what you can learn from it, that's going to be your best coaching than anything I can tell you. I'd rather be a sounding board to you because you're going to learn more from this mistake than anything else. And you know what? That young lady is now one of the most successful people I've ever known in corporate America. She's killing it. She's getting offered promotions left and right. So you want to face these issues and do not avoid it, and using the persist framework. So if I were to give you any call to action right now, in all of the content I've covered in this podcast today, pick which area you would say that you may have to have that man or woman or whatever you identify as conversation in the mirror. And whatever that friction point is, whether it's laughing because you're uncomfortable, or it's not listening, you need to use the SEER, sense, interpret, evaluate, or just going through the persist acronym framework and how to handle conflict. Just pick one, because let's be real. If you've taken the time to listen to this podcast, you've already given me more value than I can ever ask for. And I hopefully have returned the favor in your attention as well. So if this was for you, feel free to follow us, give us a 5-star review, and we look forward to producing more content like this for you through the Persistent Managers podcast. Thank you very much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Persistent Managers Podcast, which helps managers and direct reports win faster. Join our podcast newsletter for more insights to win faster, completely free.